Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Law Future Centre seminar. Today we've got Dr. Jessica Whyte from, is it Western Sydney University?
It is now, yes.
It's Western Sydney University. Yes, Jess is an ARC DECRA Fellow, and she works on integrating European philosophy, human rights theory and 20th century intellectual history, and she's particularly interested in looking at the politics of life during the 20th century, particularly since World War II. At the moment she's working on an ARC funded project entitled Inventing Collateral Damage, the Changing Moral Economy of War. And that project is looking at a philosophical inquiry into the implications of the decisions that get made about some civilian deaths being justified in the public good. But she's very well known for her work on human rights, I think, humanitarianism, and particularly neoliberalism, and has published widely in these areas. Her first book was on Agamben. It was entitled Catastrophe and Redemption, the Political Thought of Giorgio Agamben. And her next, or at least forthcoming book in the field that she's going to be talking about today is going to be published by Verso next year, I think.
Yes.
So it's The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism. So I'd just like to sort of note on a personal note that I hope this isn't too much of a surprise for me to mention this, but I was making dinner one Sunday night and I heard your voice on the radio. It was very pleasant to hear Jess talking on ABCRN's Philosopher's Zone on neoliberalism and human rights. It was a great program, and
it's a part that you were making dinner.
Right. Okay. This is the subject, in fact, of her talk today, which is entitled Neoliberalism, Human Rights and the Sweetness of Commerce.
Wonderful.
So,
thanks very
Jess.
much, Chris. And thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. I am going to read, which possibly feels a bit formal for this grouping, but feel free to stop me at any point if you want to ask questions or if anything is unclear. So I'm going to start with a quote, which is from the draft statement of aims of the Neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society, established in 1947 as an attempt to refound liberalism. And that quote, it says, "Any free society presupposes, in particular, a widely accepted moral code. The principles of this moral code should govern collective no less than private action." Okay. In the wake of 2017's devastating Grenfell fire, the leader of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, sparked outrage by calling for the requisitioning of empty investment properties to house survivors of the incinerated apartment block. As survivors slept out in churches, mosques and local halls, Corbyn's call to appropriate so-called land-banked houses challenged the sanctity of private property. Writing in The Times a month later, the Conservative Party peer Daniel Finkelstein cited these events as reason to support the Human Rights Act. Comparing Corbyn to the former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, he wrote, "This is exactly the reason we have human rights protection, so people can secure their individual liberty, in this case their right to property, when the popular will is against them." For this wealthy lord, human rights were not for Grenfell's survivors, among them undocumented migrants, who, as Hannah Arendt noted long ago, should have been the exemplary subjects of human rights. Rather, human rights were necessary to protect a weak minority, Kensington's absent property owners, from the passions of the masses. At least 71 people burned to death in the Grenfell Tower. For the survivors, its burnt-out tower must be a bitter reminder of loved ones, family members, friends, neighbours. Yet Grenfell was not only a private catastrophe, it was also a deeply political and public one. Not only does it tell a contemporary tale of two cities, as Corbyn put it, referring to mansions jutting up alongside social housing towers in the highly unequal borough, it also reveals the racialisation of poverty and vulnerability in a neoliberal period in which racial segmentation occurs as much through the impersonal, colour-blind operation of the market as through direct racial discrimination. The fire was not only a result of what the Grenfell Action Group had previously warned was the dangerous ineptitude and incompetence of the council, which had failed to install a sprinkler system or repair blocked fire exits. It was also a result, as is well known, of the cladding of the building's facade, which was cladded to improve its appearance when viewed from surrounding wealthy areas, and then the cutting of costs through opting for cheap and flammable cladding. So Grenfell embodies a neoliberal urbanism characterised by the downgrading of social housing, the flouting of regulations, and the outsourcing of both renovations and fire safety assessments to the lowest bidder in a context of gentrification and the erosion of the supply of social housing. Faced with such inequality and neglect, it would be easy to dismiss Finkelstein's evocations of the human rights of property owners as pure cynicism. Human rights, it is commonly supposed, are among the few weapons the marginalised still have. Indeed, in the wake of the fire, a United Nations envoy announced that the UK may have breached its obligation to provide a human right to housing, and the Independent Equality and Human Rights Commission appointed a panel of legal experts to examine whether the government had violated its obligations under the same Human Rights Act. 1 year on, with little affordable housing in the borough, only 82 of the 203 households who lost their homes in the fire had been permanently rehoused. However easy it is to dismiss the idea of Kensington's absentee investors as the subject of human rights, it is more difficult to demarcate a true human rights discourse from cynical appropriations of it. What Niamh Gordon and Nicola Perugini call the human right to dominate exists alongside the human rights of the dominated, and human rights have proved at least as useful in protecting the wealthy and legitimising the interventions of the most powerful states as they have in protecting the powerless. When former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher began privatising social housing in the 1980s, she also justified it as a way to secure human rights. Evoking a deep connection between liberty and property, Thatcher argued, and I quote, "Those countries which deny private property rights also deny other human rights." The claim that property rights are an essential foundation for other human rights, in the words of the Chicago School economist Milton Friedman, helped to justify the neoliberal counter-revolution of the late 20th century. The language of human rights is notoriously slippery, marked by a tactical polyvalence, in Michel Foucault's words, according to which the effect of identical formulations differs according, in his words, to who is speaking, his position of power, and the institutional context in which he happens to be speaking. Yet to recognise that human rights lack a single meaning, that they're contingent political discourses, not unchangeable metaphysical attributes of human nature, is not enough to explain the ease with which human rights discourses have been mobilised in defence of wealth and power in the period of neoliberal hegemony. Moreover, it fails to explain how mainstream human rights NGOs, which sought not to open the gates of paradise but to bolt the gates of hell, in André Glucksmann's words, furthered a neoliberal closure of the political imagination by contending that the road to hell is paved by emancipatory and revolutionary intentions. So the forthcoming book that Chris mentioned, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, is an investigation of the historical and conceptual relations between human rights and neoliberalism. It seeks to explain why these two revivals and reinventions of liberalism took place at the same time, and why their trajectories have been so implicated with each other ever since. The book is framed by a double coincidence. It's often been noted that the embrace of the language of human rights in Anglo-American and European polities took place in the late 70s, just as governments also began to embrace neoliberalism. Attesting to this convergence, the Chicago School Milton Friedman's 1976 Nobel Prize in Economics was followed the next year by Amnesty International's 77 Nobel Peace Prize. But less well noted is the fact that in 1947, when the UN Commission on Human Rights met for the first time at Lake Success to begin drafting an international Bill of Rights, a group of economists, philosophers and historians were gathered across the Atlantic in the Swiss alpine village of Montpellier to consider the principles that could animate a new liberal order. The efforts of the first group resulted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was conceived as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations. The latter grouping founded the Mont Pelerin Society, which has been aptly described as the neoliberal thought collective. In 1947, the divergences between these two groupings were more significant than their convergences. While both were concerned with threats to human dignity and liberty in the wake of World War II, the human rights delegates adopted an extensive list of social and economic rights, while the neoliberals depicted state welfare and planning as totalitarian threats to what they called Western civilization. Yet surprisingly perhaps, when a distinctive and powerful version of NGO-led human rights came to prominence 30 years later, earlier attempts to enshrine rights to housing, food, education and medical care were supplanted by a narrow focus on civil and political rights. This version of human rights became hegemonic alongside a neoliberal assault on both the welfare state and post-colonial attempts to restructure the international economy in the interests of global equality. Human rights became the dominant ideology of a period marked by the belief, succinctly expressed by Thatcher, that there is no alternative. The economic transformations of this period were stark, from the rise of austerity and the retrenchment of state welfare provision to commodification of public services and growing indebtedness. Nonetheless, I contend that we can't understand why human rights and neoliberalism flourish together if we view neoliberalism simply as an economic doctrine. Neoliberalism is commonly understood as an amoral economic ideology which subordinates all values to an economic rationality. In a powerful instance of this critique, Wendy Brown argues that neoliberalism's economisation of life configures the human, I quote, always, only and everywhere as Homo economicus. Elsewhere, Brown argues that despite its pragmatic reconciliation with neoconservatism in the United States, neoliberalism is, I quote, expressly amoral at the level of both ends and means. This form of criticism is not new, and nor is it confined to this neoliberal form of capitalism. It resembles nothing so much as the Communist Manifesto's awestruck descriptions of the bourgeoisie, which leaves no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment, in Marx and Engels' words. Although the argument that capitalism drowns all values in the icy water of egotistical calculation was borrowed from capitalism's earlier conservative critics, Marx and Engels were without nostalgia for feudal bonds cemented by religion and sentimentality. Contemporary critics, while largely agreeing that neoliberalism reduces all values to cash value, have been similarly divided about whether this is cause for celebration or denunciation. For Michel Foucault, writing in 1979, the newly ascendant neoliberalism seemed to offer a refreshing break with the punitive moralism of earlier liberalisms. In the Chicago School human capital theorist Gary Becker's purely economic analysis, as Foucault called it, he saw a fundamentally amoral account of the criminal as Homo economicus, who acts expecting a profit and bears the risk of penal sanction. From such a perspective, Foucault noted, there is no difference between the infraction of the highway code and a premeditated murder. Consequently, a neoliberal penal policy would merely adjust penalties and rules to reduce the supply of crime, while eschewing the attempt to discipline the criminal and cure her of her pathology. Foucault therefore speculated that a neoliberal society would not be a moralising society of normalisation and exclusion, but one in which, in his words, minority individuals and practices are tolerated. Brown's own position is starkly different. In the neoliberal economisation of life, she sees a fundamental threat to democracy. Neoliberalism constitutes subjects who are indifferent towards democratic political values, she argues, and positively antagonistic to egalitarianism. Consequently, political problems are transformed into individual problems with market solutions, while civil liberties, the rule of law and fair elections are, in her words, wholly desacralised. Moreover, the neoliberal hollowing out of democracy, she argues, paradoxically provides fertile ground for neoconservative attempts to bolster the foundations of family, religion and state, in part through a civilisational discourse that moralises a certain imagery of the West and its values. If neoliberalism is understood in such terms as an amoral economism, then international human rights NGOs, with their focus on universalism, civil liberty, human dignity and bodily integrity, seem an important antidote to the unrelenting economisation of life. Despite her own trenchant criticisms of rights and liberal forms of political subjectivity in previous works, Brown's indictment of neoliberalism leads her to a surprisingly sympathetic account of the liberal democratic model she believes we're losing. While she recognises that liberal rights can also be economised in a neoliberal era, she worries, and I quote, that we are no longer creatures of moral autonomy, freedom or equality. We no longer choose our own ends or the means to them. Although Brown provides a compelling account of the economisation of rights in a neoliberal era, the assumption remains that older ideals of dignity, rights, and what she calls soulfulness have been sacrificed upon the altar of an unrelentingly economistic dogma. From the perspective of my book, these accounts of the amoral economism of neoliberalism miss the distinctive morality that was central to its rise. What distinguished the neoliberals of the 20th century from their 19th century precursors, I argue, was not their narrow understanding of the human as homo economicus, but their belief that a functioning competitive market required an adequate moral foundation. The founding statement of the Mont Pelerin Society made this clear, diagnosing a civilizational crisis characterised by what it called the disappearance of the conditions for human dignity and threats to freedom of thought and expression. The statement states that these developments have been fostered by the growth of a view of history which denies all absolute moral standards. Rather than an external supplement or a pragmatic partner, social conservatism, including explicit appeals to family values, Christianity and Western civilization, were foundational to the consolidation of organised neoliberalism in the mid-20th century. Far from reducing all of life to economics, I show that the neoliberals of the mid-20th century were deeply suspicious of the very idea of the economy. In his polemical 1944 critique of socialist planning, The Road to Serfdom, the founder of the Mont Pelerin Society, Friedrich Hayek, complained about his contemporaries' preoccupation with economistic and materialist concerns. The values that rank lowest today and are dismissed as 19th century illusions, he wrote, are the moral values: liberty and independence, truth and intellectual honesty, peace and democracy, and respect for the individual qua man instead of merely as a member of an organised group. Around the same time, the German ordo-liberal and Mont Pelerin Society member Wilhelm Röpke criticised the economism, which in his words judges everything in relation to the economy and in terms of material productivity, making material and economic interests the centre of things by deducing everything from them and subordinating everything to them as mere means to an end. No doubt there are aspects of organised neoliberalism that support the charge of economisation. From Ludwig von Mises' argument that the market is a permanent election in which each dollar counts as a ballot, to James Buchanan's public choice theory, which reconfigures politics as a sphere of self-maximising individual competition, neoliberalism appears to be the extension of economic rationality to all areas of life. Yet, drawing on the ancient Greek origins of economics in oikonomia, the management of a household, the early neoliberals worried that conceiving of the overall social order as an economy licensed the belief that it was governed by collective solidarity and had a single set of ends that could be managed by Keynesian or social democratic planners. This, they argued, was the very definition of totalitarianism. So, rather than being distinguished by their narrow account of Homo economicus, I argue that what distinguished the neoliberals of the 20th century was their belief that a functioning competitive market must be complemented by what Hayek called the morals of the market. The book focuses on those strands of early neoliberal thought that were particularly focused on the requirements of civilization that they depicted as indistinguishably moral, racial and economic. So I look particularly at members of the Austrian school, the German ordo-liberals, but I also suggest that this moral impetus actually played a much larger role in Chicago school neoliberalism and also in neoliberal development theory than is often noticed. So, the morals of the market. What Hayek referred to as the morals of the market were a set of individualistic commercial values that promoted wealth accumulation, investment and submission to impersonal laws at the expense of the deliberate pursuit of collectively formulated ends. Appropriating the evolutionary social theory of the Scottish Enlightenment, Hayek argued that the evolution from what he called the small band to the great society required the abandonment of feelings of personal loyalty and egalitarian commitments, which he framed as more suitable to tribal existence. The transition to the market economy, he argued, was achieved through deeply resented breaches of the solidarity that governed earlier social relations. Man, Hayek wrote, has been civilised very much against his wishes. Society, Hayek argued, evolved through the survival of the successful, that is, through the emulation of the morals and the institutions of successful groups. Such a position legitimised inequality by conceiving of wealth as evidence of moral superiority. It also portrayed Europeans as the models for all peoples, and the shift from status relations to submission to the rule of law as the necessary path of civilisation. In premising freedom on submission to legal and moral rules, Hayek formulated what I describe as an anthropology of obedience. Man, he wrote later in life, is as much a rule-following animal as a purpose-seeking one. In his contemporaries' demands for social justice and social and economic rights, Hayek saw atavistic attempts to return from the market society to the morals of the small band. Socialism and social democracy were not merely economic threats on this argument, they were civilizational regressions, the return of what he called suppressed primordial instincts that threatened the moral foundations of the competitive market. So one of the key arguments that I make throughout the book is that the neoliberal argument for the market was itself moral and political rather than strictly economic. I argue that early neoliberals attributed to the market a series of anti-political virtues, checking and dispersing power, facilitating social cooperation, pacifying conflict, and securing individual liberty and rights. They presented commercial or civil society as a space of mutually beneficial voluntary relations that they contrasted with the violence, coercion, and conflict that they saw as endemic to politics. Market coordination on this account was less a means to enhance productivity than a substitute for the violence, coercion, and despotism that they argued, along Schmittian lines, was endemic to politics, and especially to mass politics. In extolling the pacifying virtues of the market, I argue that the neoliberals revived an older political argument for capitalism, first identified by Albert Hirschman in his classic 1977 book, The Passions and the Interests. There, Hirschman uncovers what he calls the doux commerce, or sweetness of commerce thesis, which he argues was conventional wisdom in the mid-18th century. Hirschman's account of the moral virtues of the market began with a sentence in the Baron de Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which he ultimately chose for his own book's epigraph. It is fortunate for men to be in a situation where, though their passions may prompt them to be wicked, they have nevertheless an interest in not being so. The view that the interests could check or countervail the passions, Hirschman argues, was a message of salvation for a world trapped between the violence of the passions and the seeming ineffectiveness of reason. Far from viewing commerce as corrupting, Montesquieu praised it for bringing with it, and I quote, the spirit of frugality, economy, moderation, work, wisdom, tranquility, order, and rule. Commerce, he argued, is a source of gentleness, softness, and polish, which cures destructive prejudice and leads to more gentle mores. For Montesquieu, those who pursue their interests through commerce stood in a relation of mutual need, and thus, in his words, the natural effect of commerce is to lead to peace. Montesquieu, of course, wrote at a time when world trade was violent and dangerous, inseparable from colonial conquest and the slave trade. Marx mocked accounts of the pacifying role of commerce in his writings on the primitive accumulation of capital. After describing in garish detail the history of Dutch colonialism, with its secret prisons, assassinations, bribery and enslavement, Marx remarked sarcastically, "That is peaceful commerce." Yet it was only when this violence came home with the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars and the social dislocation of the Industrial Revolution, Hirschman argues, that belief in the sweetness of commerce lost its hold on the European imagination. By the 20th century, Hirschman concluded, no observer could still subscribe to this peaceful, pacifying version of the market, and he argues that the market's subsequent defenders focused more on its economic benefits, drawing from Adam Smith to valorise the increased productivity and efficiency made possible by the division of labour. In contrast to Hirschman's position, I argue that a variant of this justification of capitalism was central to neoliberal thought in the inauspicious circumstances of the 20th century. For Hayek, who described his own project as doing for the 20th century what Montesquieu had done for the 18th, and for his neoliberal colleagues, the challenge was to revive the argument that a society coordinated through the competitive market would replace the coercion, conflict and conquest that they saw as endemic to politics with voluntary, mutually beneficial, harmonious social relations that would guarantee individual freedom and rights. Variants of Hirschman's thesis, I argue, run through the argument of Hayek's mentor, Ludwig von Mises, that if not for the greater productivity of the division of labour, there would be no sentiments of sympathy or goodwill, but only endless bloody fighting. And he's absolutely serious. He says without market exchange, people would have absolutely no reason to be nice to each other ever, at all. Like, it's quite an extraordinary argument. This argument is central to Hayek's description of the market as a catalaxy, a term derived from the Greek verb katalatein, which means both to exchange and to turn from an enemy into a friend. It informs Röpke's argument that allowing individuals to pursue their interests through the market leads to harmonious social coordination, while the pursuit of interest through the political process brings millions of conflicting interests into play. And it appears even in the positivist Friedman's argument that the use of political channels strains the social cohesion essential for a stable society, while the use of the market reduces tension by making it unnecessary for individuals to agree on ultimate ends. If neoliberal thinkers and human rights activists could find common cause, as I suggest they could, this is largely because the concerns of 20th century neoliberals were far less narrowly economic than existing accounts tend to allow. What set the early neoliberals apart from earlier defenders of the sweetness of commerce was not their narrow vision of Homo economicus, but their belief that the market is highly fragile, artificial order that requires a moral foundation, a legal order, and a powerful state capable of securing what Röpke called respect for the rights of others. Of course, while the neoliberals stressed the need for human rights, not any version of human rights would do. The Chicago School economist Deirdre McCloskey holds up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as evidence that market capitalism promotes what she calls the temperance to educate oneself in business and in life, to listen to the customer humbly, to resist the temptations to cheat, to ask quietly whether there might be a compromise here, like Eleanor Roosevelt negotiating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. End of quote. No doubt the drafting of the Universal Declaration required compromises between defenders of rival political and economic and religious systems. But one thing that the drafters largely agreed on, and Roosevelt was no exception here, was that the unrestrained market produced not sweetness and civility, but conflict and disorder. Looking back in 1976, Hayek was far less complimentary than McCloskey about the compromises that produced the UDHR. The document, he argued, was an incoherent attempt to merge the liberal rights tradition with a starkly different one derived from the Marxist Russian Revolution. In 1992, Milton Friedman was asked about the original purpose of the Mont Pelerin Society. There is no doubt, he replied, that its purpose was to promote a classical liberal philosophy, that is, a free economy, a free society, socially, civilly, and in human rights. Coming from a thinker who described the authoritarian regime of Chile's General Pinochet as an economic and political miracle, this evocation of human rights appears out of place. After all, human rights NGOs came to prominence in the 70s precisely for contesting the torture and disappearance that accompanied neoliberal shock treatment in the Southern Cone. According to a dominant view, then, neoliberal emphases on competitive markets and austerity are self-evidently at odds with human rights. As a recent primer on human rights puts it, neoliberalism is one logic in the world today, human rights is the other. Yet I suggest that Friedman's account deserves to be taken seriously, even if it illuminates the time in which he was speaking, the 90s, more than it does the mid-20th century. While one critic has noted that human and political rights were notably absent from the 1947 Montpellier Society statement, at that time human rights were not yet an obvious aspect of a liberal tradition. The phrase human rights is similarly absent from the Oxford Manifesto, issued that same year by representatives from 19 liberal parties as a statement of principles of the Liberal International. The discourse of human rights was still under construction, and there was as yet no consensus, even amongst liberals, on the relationship between the newer language of human rights and earlier affirmations of the rights of man, fundamental rights, humanitarianism, or individual freedom under the rule of law. The neoliberals, I want to suggest, were active participants in that process of constructing human rights. Human rights played a significant and overlooked role in their mid-20th century efforts to challenge socialism, social democracy and state planning, and they contributed more than has been acknowledged to the version of human rights that came to prominence decades later. By 92, when Friedman spoke, the neoliberal argument that only a liberal market economy could foster human rights was taken as self-evident by many human rights NGOs. So my account of the relationship between human rights and neoliberalism therefore departs from that of the historian of human rights Sam Moyne, who argues that human rights NGOs were powerless companions of the rising neoliberalism of the 70s. Moyne argues that while the notion that individuals have basic rights was shaped by the political economy that always affects so much else in moral ideals, this shaping was never complete, as human rights never reverted to their 19th century role as simple protections of private property and freedom of contract. Yet rather than human rights simply being shaped by an underlying economic reality, I show that human rights were central to the neoliberal attempt to inculcate the morals of the market. As Hayek argued at the inaugural Montpellier Society, while it's always taken for granted that a functioning market relies on the protection of certain rights, such as property and enforcement of contracts, it was only once this was accepted that the real problem begins. So the neoliberals were by no means content to rest with the 19th century idea of protection of contract and property. The real problem for the neoliberals was to formulate an account of rights that would serve as a legal and moral framework for the global extension of capitalist social relations. The neoliberals saw human rights and competitive markets as mutually constitutive. In his best-selling polemic, The Road to Serfdom, Hayek argued that all claims made on behalf of individuals can be attributed to the rise of what he calls the commercial spirit. The ideas of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, he writes, are characteristically commercial ideas which have no other purpose but to secure certain advantages to individuals. For Hayek and his fellow neoliberals, the competitive market made individual rights possible, but the market's functioning also depended on a rule of law and on the recognition of what Hayek called the inalienable rights of the individual, the inviolable rights of man. Hayek's account of the rights of man owed much to his more utilitarian mentor von Mises, whose 1922 study of socialism argued that individual rights emerged hand in hand with the development of capitalism. Once men gained economic freedom, Mises argued, they soon desired it elsewhere and sought legal recognition of the subjective rights of citizens. Rights, according to such a perspective, do not inhere naturally in the human person. Rather, they arise only when the capitalist division of labour allows individuals to pursue their own interests and values and frees them from the arbitrary power of others. It was only capitalism, Mises argues, that made human relationships material and calculable and brought freedom from the heavens down to earth. Such freedom, he writes, is no natural right. Much more recently, Hayek's student, the international trade lawyer Ernst Ulrich Petersmann, pointed to the UDHR's Article 28, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realised, to argue for the deep compatibility of human rights with the international trade law enforced by the WTO. The globalisation of human rights relies on open markets, the prohibition of economic discrimination, and welfare-enhancing division of labour enforced by the WTO, he argued. At the same time, he contended, human rights promote economic integration by, I quote, protecting personal autonomy, legal and social security, peaceful change, individual savings, investments, production, and mutually beneficial transactions across frontiers. Human rights, he concluded, echoing a UN report, make human beings not only better democratic citizens, but also better economic actors. If the market order is the real basis of all declarations of rights and charters of liberties, as Mises contended, then in his words, as soon as the economic freedom which the market economy grants to its members is removed, all political liberties and bills of rights become humbug. The correlate of seeing the contemporary market as the sine qua non of both social peace and individual rights is that human rights are subordinate to the preservation of the market order. This has significant implications for the neoliberal understanding of freedom, the single value neoliberal human rights would be expected to serve. Examined closely, the freedom neoliberals endorse is largely indistinguishable from submission to what Mises called the sovereignty of the market. Unlike political sovereignty, the neoliberals argued, market sovereignty is compatible with individual freedom. Yet they also argued that the functioning of the market relies on individuals adjusting themselves to the market's imperatives, which means sacrificing egalitarianism, community life, and an understanding of freedom that entails acting politically and collectively determining ends. In this sense, Brown is right that the contemporary liberal subject is not a subject of interest, but is so integrated into the goal of economic growth that she can easily be sacrificed to that end. Yet, rather than seeing recent austerity politics as ushering in a shift in neoliberal rationality, from limitless to constrained, from freedom to sacrifice, as Brown puts it, I argue that the willingness to sacrifice individuals to the market was foundational to neoliberal thought. For the neoliberals, adjustment to the market was secured primarily by price fluctuations, that is, by what Marx called the dull compulsion of economic relations. Writing about wages in an unregulated market, Mises wrote that such fluctuations penalise disobedience and recompense obedience to the demands of the labour market. As this penal language makes clear enough, the neoliberal subject is not free in any expansive sense. The demands of the sovereign market, Mises states explicitly, and I quote, submit the individual to a harsh social pressure and indirectly limit the individual's freedom to choose his occupation. Yet he suggests that this pressure leaves the individual a margin in the limits of which, I quote, in the limits of which he can choose between what suits him better and suits him less. It is only within this predetermined margin that the individual is free to choose. She may leave her home to pursue work in another city, or she may stay at home and drive for Uber. She may not join a trade union, let alone struggle against the capitalist exploitation of wage labour. For Mises, and I quote, this amount of freedom is the maximum of freedom that an individual can enjoy in the framework of the social division of labour. The role of neoliberal human rights, I argue, is to ensure that human action is confined within what I call this margin of freedom. By pathologising mass politics and political violence, neoliberal human rights secure the margins of a liberal capitalist order, and capitalism and exploitation become the eternal horizon of freedom. The individual, under an idealised neoliberal market, is doubly free, to use Marx's term, free of the compulsion that typified earlier forms of exploitation, but free also of any option but to submit to the harsh social pressure of the market. In reality, of course, such direct compulsion has never been absent. Indeed, a central function of neoliberal human rights has been to legitimise state violence aimed at the global dissemination of capitalist social relations. So, to conclude, final section on a new standard of civilisation. In his opening address at the inaugural Montpellier Society Conference, the Swiss economist and diplomat William Rappard depicted his colleagues as the inheritors of both Adam Smith's economic science and his liberal politics. What Smith didn't realise, this world-travelled diplomat Rappard argued, was that the economic man underpinning his science was, I quote, like Smith himself, a Scotchman who preferred to work and to save rather than idly to enjoy idleness. Rappard contrasted this Scotch brand of Homo economicus, for whom work was a virtue and saving a characteristic trait, with the Algerian Arabs he had witnessed in Algiers 5 years earlier, shunning work and enjoying themselves by sitting idly on the sidewalks. Had Smith been reared among the sun-based race of Arabs who prefer leisure to work and equality to liberty, he speculated, and this is a quote, would his semi-tropical economic man not have led him quite consistently to preach a very different doctrine? Smith's liberal economics, Rappard believed, could only thrive in conditions inhabited by a very distinctive subject. It was not only his international experience that had taught Rappard that Smith's particular brand of Homo economicus was not a natural man. Even the European economic man today is clamouring for social security and equality much more than for economic progress and freedom, he told his compatriots. If early neoliberalism was a response to what the conservative Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset called the revolt of the masses, as I argue it was, then reviving international liberalism would require an international and moral order to cultivate the hard-working, thrifty subjects that a liberal market presupposed. For all the prescience of Foucault's 1979 lectures on neoliberalism, his use of the term state phobia to define early neoliberalism is therefore misleading. Rather than rejecting the state, the neoliberals sought to ensure that existing states function to bolster the market and repress rather than express the egalitarian aspirations of their people. What was needed, as Wilhelm Röpke put it, was a strong state aloof from the hungry hordes of vested interests, and perhaps especially from the hungry vested interests. The neoliberals became particularly preoccupied with questions of such integration as post-colonial states embraced social planning and welfarism and threatened to undo their country's positions in the existing international division of labour. Referring to socialist governments that clung to their sovereignty in what he called the economically backward nations, Mises wrote, "If this system of sovereignty had been adopted 100 years ago, it would have been impossible to exploit the oil fields of Mexico, Venezuela and Iran, to establish the rubber plantations in Malaya, or to develop the banana production of Central America." In a world in which governments increasingly interfered with business, he argued, the principle of each nation's unrestricted sovereignty is a challenge to all other nations. Sovereignty must be restricted to the extent required to secure complete commitment to a market economy. Both the neoliberals and a new generation of human rights NGOs, as I show in the book, set themselves against this post-colonial sovereignty. For both, decolonisation generated a desperate need for new standards to constrain post-colonial states. The inculcation of the morals of the market, which Hayek called the taming of the savage, had its complement in what he called the taming of the state. As anti-colonialists used the language of human rights to support their struggles for national self-determination, including economic self-determination, the neoliberals formulated a different vision of human rights, conceived as the heritage of a besieged Western civilization, defined by individualistic social norms, peaceful social relations coordinated by the market, strong families, and anti-egalitarian morality and Christian faith. Much of this, I think, sounds quite familiar today. Redefined so as to secure the margin of individual freedom enabled by a competitive market, human rights could serve a new civilising mission that would secure property and private investments, restrain collective politics, foster personal responsibility, and license transformative interventions to remake the world along capitalist lines. This version of human rights was taken up by US President Ronald Reagan, who came to office a human rights skeptic, but soon embraced the language as an aspect of his Cold War crusade against Soviet totalitarianism that would secure human dignity as the crowning ideal of Western civilization. Along the same lines, Donald Trump shocked observers who had pinned him as an America First isolationist by explicitly embracing the community of nations of the West in a major speech in Warsaw in 2017. The US and Europe are a civilization with a common destiny and shared values, he told his audience, singling out the not always easily reconcilable values of empowering women and placing faith and family at the centre of life. Praising the rule of law and the right to free speech and evoking threats from the South, the East, and from a creeping government bureaucracy, Trump argued that the West, I quote, values the dignity of every human life, protects the rights of every person, and shares the hope of every soul to live in freedom. So I argue in the book that this neoliberal background can shed light on the apparent puzzle that the human rights politics of the 20th century, with its distinctive use of international advocacy to limit sovereign power, emerged, in Moyne's words, seemingly from nowhere. I showed that organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and Médecins Sans Frontières drew, explicitly in some cases and implicitly in others, on an account of rights developed by the neoliberal thinkers since the 40s. Although the human rights NGOs came to prominence in the context of the evisceration of social welfare protections and public services, these concerns rarely entered the frame of their early advocacy. In his major biography of the international human rights movement, Ariane Nair, the former head of Human Rights Watch, suggested that the rise of human rights coincided with a shift of Cold War rhetoric from an economic competition between communism and capitalism to a political conflict of repression or totalitarianism versus liberty or human rights. So in the book, I argue that the major human rights and humanitarian NGOs embraced the central neoliberal dichotomy between a commercial or a civil society, understood as a realm of freedom, voluntary interaction, and distributed private power that checked the centralised power of the state, on the one hand, and politics, understood as violent, coercive and conflictual on the other. They defended the same anti-political virtues that the neoliberals attributed to the market: restraining political power, taming violence, and facilitating a margin of individual freedom. Like the neoliberals, international human rights NGOs embraced law to restrain politics while avoiding those social and economic rights that could only be achieved through political action, not judicial sanction. The methodology of many human rights NGOs, as Kenneth Roth, the director of Human Rights Watch, notes, consists in the ability to investigate, expose and shame, which involves identifying a particular violation, a specific violator and a clear remedy. This has made these major NGOs both reluctant and unsuited to challenge the structural and impersonal effects of market processes. Yet, while supposedly eschewing coercion, major human rights NGOs, including Roth's, have been quite prepared to call on the military might of the most powerful states to intervene in the name of securing human rights and universalising a distinctive moral order. In the process, they have often aligned with the neoliberal embrace of a strong security state stripped of its social capacity to enforce the rule of law, secure contracts and protect private property across the globe. Then, as today, the content of human rights was a product of political struggle. Human rights are not given by nature, and there has never been a single human rights movement capable of securing a general agreement about a list of rights and their order of priority. Yet to stop at pointing out that human rights lacks a unitary meaning, as Susan Marks notes in a related context, is to silently signal that these phenomena are isolated problems, unrelated to wider processes, tendencies and dynamics at work in the world. By leaving unexamined the tendencies and dynamics that bring such transformations about, as Marx notes, we occlude an understanding of what would be necessary to achieve genuine change. What I call neoliberal human rights are not the only form of human rights to have existed, and today's human rights campaigns do not necessarily further neoliberal ends. But I would argue that neoliberal human rights are today the dominant form promoted by the most powerful international human rights NGOs, states and corporations in the period of neoliberal ascendancy. Thank you.